For decades, the English longbow had been a nightmare to France. At Crécy and Poitiers, thousands of knights fell under its volleys. In 1415 at Agincourt, King Henry V's outnumbered archers slaughtered countless French nobles in the mud. By 1429, English dominance seemed inevitable. Then, on June 18, 1429, that confidence shattered. In a single afternoon, the English army was routed at a battle nearly forgotten today. This is the tale of how one daring cavalry charge at Patay turned defeat into victory and helped forge the legend of Joan of Arc. But here's what historians got wrong. We have to understand how desperate France was in 1428. After almost a century of war, the country was broken. English armies and their Burgundian allies held Paris and most of the north. The Dauphin Charles was essentially in hiding in Chinon, with almost no money to pay his troops. People whispered everywhere that the English were unbeatable. It wasn't only a political crisis, it was a crisis of the soul. The English tactics were brutally effective. They trained bowmen for years, then carved a fence of sharpened stakes into the ground before battle. Archers hid behind those stakes, weapons strung, and unleashed a deadly volley the moment the fight began. At Crécy and Poitiers, they used this exact formation against larger French armies. At Agincourt in 1415, the same strategy helped Henry V's outnumbered troops defeat France's finest knights. By 1429, the longbow was the most feared weapon in Europe, and England seemed unstoppable. By early 1429, the siege of Orléans looked like the end of France. Since October, the English had strangled the city with walls and towers. French supplies ran out, and every day, men, women, and children risked their lives just to find food. When a powerful siege tower, the English called it the Snail, was rolled up against the Tourelle fortress, even the bravest knights felt their hope fade. If Orléans fell, there would be nothing to stop England from sweeping south into the heartland. All hope seemed lost. Then something incredible happened. A 17-year-old peasant girl appeared at the Dauphin's court in Chinon. Her name was Joan of Arc, and she insisted that God had chosen her to save France. She vowed to lift the siege of Orléans and see Charles crowned king at Reims. Many thought her mad, but Charles was desperate. He decided to take a chance on this unlikely heroine. Joan arrived outside Orléans like a bolt of lightning. She had no sword of her own, only a banner of the fleur-de-lis and an iron will. She urged the defenders to fire their cannons at a massive English siege tower called the Snail, and when enemy envoys demanded surrender, she tore up their letter in front of them. An arrow grazing her shoulder barely slowed her. In the span of 9 days, her boldness turned defeat into victory. On May 8th, the English lifted the siege. Orléans was saved. It was such an extraordinary turnaround that people called it the Miracle of Orléans. But the war wasn't over yet. The English still held key towns along the Loire, so Joan insisted the French army press on. At Jargeau on June 12th, she boldly led the assault on the town's walls. A giant stone thrown by an English defender smashed into her helmet, cracking it, and for a moment she froze. Then she shook it off and climbed back into the battle without hesitation. By nightfall, Jargeau had fallen. The English garrison was slain or captured. This evidence has never been shown before. The relief of Orléans changed the war overnight. French morale shot up to religious heights. Joan's presence had turned the beaten, defensive French army into an aggressive, confident force. No longer on the ropes, they took the fight to the enemy. In swift succession, Alençon, Dunois, and the other captains moved on the remaining English strongholds along the Loire. Jargeau had just fallen under a furious attack, and now the French swept west. They stormed Meung-sur-Loire and bombarded Beaugency until its walls buckled. Within days, the way to central France lay open. What had been a desperate cleanup became a true strategic onslaught. The English plan had fallen apart. With Jargeau, Meung, and Beaugency lost, Sir John Fastolf and John Talbot tried to retreat north toward Paris, but the French were faster. By mid-morning on June 18th, Joan's cavalry had caught the English on an old Roman road near the village of Patay. It was the moment of truth. A normal French army, exhausted and beaten, might have begged for mercy or fallen back. But this was Joan of Arc's army, driven by faith, hunger, and rage, and they were in no mood to let the English escape. As the French commanders gathered, many war-weary captains urged caution. The English longbow was still fresh in their memory, and a disorganized cavalry charge could be disaster. Seeing their hesitation, Joan grew impatient. She turned to Duke Alençon and asked, almost smiling, "Do you have good spurs?" Her message was clear. No one was going to slacken now. She declared, "In God's name, we must pursue them. Even if they were hanging on the clouds, we would still catch them." Joan's words ignited the council like a storm. Within moments, a vanguard of about 1,500 of France's best cavalry leapt into action. Heavy knights, spurred to a frenzy, thundered ahead across the sunlit fields. Leading the charge were two of France's toughest captains, Etienne de Vignoles, known as La Hire, and Jean Poton de Xaintrailles, a battle-hardened tactician. Leather and mail clinked as the French horses strained to close the gap. The chase was on. The hunt for the English had begun. The English commanders, John Talbot and Sir John Fastolf, realized they had no choice but to make a stand. They chose to fight near the village of Patay, along the old Roman road bordered by woods. This narrow stretch was perfect for an ambush. Sir John Talbot, fearless as ever, positioned his forces on the road, while Fastolf marshaled the rest to cover the retreat. Hidden in the tree line, English archers prepared their stakes and bows for a deadly surprise. Talbot had picked about 500 of his best bowmen and men-at-arms and concealed them in the woods flanking the road. They hammered stakes into the ground and readied a deadly crossfire. It was a chilling plan. If French cavalry charged down this lane, they would be trapped in a hail of arrows, just like at Agincourt all those years before. On the morning of June 18th, the French knights, believing the English were on the run, thundered down the path straight into the trap. It should have been the perfect ambush. But then something unbelievable happened, one of the strangest accidents in military history. As French scouts moved in, a lone stag suddenly bolted out of the woods and dashed across the hidden archers' line. Instinct took over. A few of the hunters let out a loud halloo to rally on the deer. That single cry echoed through the trees, and in an instant, the trap was betrayed. The French cavalry immediately knew where the ambush lay. It was a thoughtless mistake, one loud exclamation that would prove the most expensive blunder England ever made. Wait until you see what happens next. The cry rang out and then silence, but by then it was too late. French scouts had heard it clearly and realized the trap was sprung. At once they raced back to the commanders. There was no more hesitation. In a heartbeat, the French vanguards spurred their chargers and thundered through the woods. They crashed out of the trees straight onto the flank of the hidden archers. A wall of armored horses and charging lancers burst into the ambush without warning. The French cavalry crashed into the archers like a tidal wave. It was not a battle, it was a massacre. English longbowmen, who were about to slaughter a retreating enemy, found themselves trapped and helpless. Many of their bows weren't even strung yet. Within moments, French knights and men-at-arms rode them down, cutting them to pieces with swords and lances before they could raise any defense. It was Agincourt in reverse. The hunters had become the hunted. In minutes, Talbot's 500 archers were wiped out. Talbot himself fought fiercely, but he was knocked off his horse and overwhelmed. Before long, the greatest knight of England was captured. His men were left leaderless and terrified. Sir John Fastolf realized all was lost and gathered a few riders to escape. His flight triggered a full-scale rout as the remaining English scattered in panic. The Battle of Patay was over almost as soon as it began. The English army was shattered in minutes. By late afternoon, the field was strewn with corpses, hard as that is to imagine. French casualties were almost nil. English losses were nearly complete. When Joan arrived afterward, legend says she was so moved by the carnage that she dismounted to comfort a dying English soldier. She held his head in her lap as he confessed his sins. It was mercy in a moment of horror, showing Joan as both a fierce warrior and a devout soul capable of compassion. The consequences of Patay were immediate and immense. With Fastolf's army crushed, nothing stood between Charles and the sacred city of Reims, the only rightful place to crown a French king. Just a month later, on July 17th, 1429, Charles was crowned King of France in Reims Cathedral, with Joan of Arc standing at his side, her banner held high. It was the glorious climax of her mission. Patay had turned the tide of the 100 Years' War. England never truly recovered from the blow. The balance of power in Europe had irreversibly shifted. Though often overshadowed by Orléans, Patay was one of the most important victories of the 100 Years' War. It wasn't won by brilliant strategy, but by the courage of an unlikely heroine, veteran captains, and one freak accident. The English army that had terrified France was undone by a single hunting cry. A deer fleeing the woods that morning did more to redraw Europe's map than any general's plan. For more on Joan's story, try Helen Castor's Joan of Arc, a history, or Stephen Cooper's The Real Falstaff. Film fans can watch The Passion of Joan of Arc or The Messenger, and if you ever find yourself in France, visit the Effet de Serre Museum at Patay, the Château de Chinon, or Reims Cathedral. Now tell us, what was the biggest factor in the French victory? Comment below and make sure to subscribe and click the bell for more epic history.